March 7, 1945. 11,000 feet above the suburbs of Berlin, Oberstleutnant Werner Mölders watched the contrails form against the pale morning sky. His Messerschmitt BF-109 K4, one of the Luftwaffe's latest production fighters, climbed steadily through the thin air at combat power. The radio crackled with the urgent voice of the ground controller at Tempelhof. Achtung! Multiple enemy formations approaching from the west. Range approximately 40 kilometers. Altitude 25,000 feet. Estimated 90 seconds to city center. 90 seconds. That was all the warning Mölders and his small formation of 6 fighters would receive before American Mustangs arrived at over 400 miles per hour, diving from their superior altitude with energy and speed that made interception nearly impossible. The mathematics were brutally simple. By the time Mölders' formation reached 20,000 feet, the American fighters would already be overhead, choosing when and where to engage, dictating the terms of combat with the tactical flexibility that came from superior altitude, superior speed, and superior numbers. This was not the war the Luftwaffe had planned to fight, not the war they had trained for through 1943, when German fighters could still climb to meet incoming bomber formations with adequate time to organize coordinated attacks. The arrival of long-range American escort fighters in late 1943 had changed everything, but it was the refinement of American tactics through 1944 and into 1945 that had reduced German interception operations to desperate gambles conducted under impossible time constraints. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The concept of reaction time in aerial warfare had always been critical, but it became absolutely decisive when one side possessed fighters that could cover vast distances at speeds that compressed decision-making windows to mere moments. American P-51 Mustangs, cruising at 300 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, could accelerate in a dive to well over 400 miles per hour, sometimes reaching 440 miles per hour under optimal conditions with war emergency power settings. When diving from altitude advantage, these fighters traveled at speeds that translated to more than 6 miles per minute, 7 1/3 miles per minute at maximum velocity. German ground observers tracking incoming formations had perhaps 90 to 120 seconds between visual acquisition or radar detection and the moment those fighters arrived overhead. That interval represented the absolute maximum warning time available to Luftwaffe pilots scrambling from airfields around Berlin. In practice, the actual time available for interception preparation was considerably less. Pilots had to reach their aircraft, start engines, complete pre-flight checks, taxi to takeoff positions, and begin climbing toward combat altitude, while simultaneously attempting to gain position relative to fast-moving targets that were already above them, already faster than them, and already holding every tactical advantage that altitude and speed conferred in aerial combat. The strategic situation that created these impossible tactical conditions began developing in late 1943, when American escort fighters first appeared over Germany in numbers sufficient to provide continuous protection to bomber formations throughout their missions deep into the Reich. Prior to this development, German fighters had operated under different tactical constraints that, while challenging, remained within the boundaries of feasible interception tactics developed through years of combat experience. German air defense doctrine through 1942 and into 1943 had assumed that bomber formations penetrating German airspace would arrive without fighter escort, or at most with limited escort coverage that extended only to the German frontier before Allied fighters reached their maximum range and turned back toward England. This assumption reflected the technical limitations of Allied fighters available during that period. British Spitfires possessed excellent performance characteristics, but severely limited range that restricted them to operations over the Channel and northern France. American P-47 Thunderbolts, which began arriving in the European theatre in early 1943, offered longer range than Spitfires, but still could not escort bombers beyond Western Germany before fuel constraints forced them to return to base. German interception tactics evolved around these Allied limitations, Luftwaffe fighters would climb toward incoming bomber formations after they crossed into German airspace, using the time and distance available to organize coordinated attacks that maximized chances of breaking through defensive formations and inflicting significant losses on bomber formations before they reached their targets. This approach required German fighters to maintain standing patrols at altitude or scramble quickly after receiving raid warnings, but it provided sufficient time for experienced leaders to assemble formations, gain altitude advantage, and execute planned attack sequences. The tactical timeline worked because German pilots operated from interior lines with shorter distances to fly to reach interception positions, and because Allied bombers flew at speeds around 200 miles per hour, considerably slower than the 350 to 400 mile per hour speeds German fighters could achieve while climbing or in level flight. The absence of long-range Allied escort fighters meant German pilots could concentrate entirely on attacking bombers without needing to engage in fighter-versus-fighter combat, while simultaneously maintaining formation integrity and coordinating attacks against heavily defended bomber boxes. This relatively stable tactical situation lasted through the first half of 1943, even as American bomber formations grew larger and raids penetrated deeper into the Reich. German air defense units suffered significant losses during this period, but they also inflicted substantial casualties on American bomber groups, particularly during missions to heavily defended targets like the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt and the aircraft production facilities at Regensburg. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14, 1943, demonstrated both the effectiveness and the limitations of German air defense under these conditions. The 8th Air Force dispatched 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses to attack the ball-bearing plants deep in southern Germany without fighter escort for most of the mission. German fighters attacked relentlessly throughout the penetration and withdrawal phases. The bombers fought back with mass defensive firepower, but the attackers inflicted devastating losses. 60 American bombers were shot down. Another 17 sustained damage so severe they would never fly again. 5 more crashed in England immediately after landing. Combined casualties totaled 77 bombers destroyed, and more than 600 aircrew killed, wounded, or captured. The losses represented more than 26% of the attacking force, a casualty rate that could not be sustained. American commanders recognized that unescorted daylight precision bombing operations could not continue at acceptable cost without fighter protection throughout the entire mission radius. The solution arrived in December 1943 when P-51B Mustangs began equipping fighter groups assigned to bomber escort duties. The Mustang possessed revolutionary range characteristics that fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the air war over Europe. With internal fuel and external drop tanks, P-51 seconds could escort bomber formations to Berlin and beyond, remain with the bombers throughout the target area, engage German fighters attempting to attack the formations, and return safely to England with adequate fuel reserves. The first Mustang-escorted raid to Berlin occurred on March 4, 1944, when 68 P-51 seconds from the 354th, 357th, and 363rd Fighter Groups accompanied bombers all the way to the Reich capital. German controllers monitoring the approaching formations initially assumed, based on years of experience, that Allied fighters would turn back before reaching Berlin. When the Mustangs remained with the bomber formations over the target, the fundamental nature of German air defense operations changed permanently. Luftwaffe fighters attempting to attack American bombers now faced a new and profoundly difficult tactical problem. They had to fight their way through screens of fast, high-altitude escort fighters before they could even reach the bomber formations. The escorts operated at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where German fighters experienced increasingly severe performance limitations, while P-51 seconds with their two-stage Merlin engines performed exceptionally well. The tactical timeline that had previously allowed German pilots adequate time to organize coordinated attacks now compressed dramatically. American fighters typically preceded bomber formations by approximately 10 to 20 minutes, arriving at altitude with substantial energy advantage. They could position themselves to intercept climbing German fighters before those fighters reached the bombers, forcing the German pilots into defensive combat at disadvantageous altitude and energy states. This new reality manifested most clearly in the warning time available to German pilots. Ground controllers tracking incoming raids could detect bomber formations at considerable distances through visual observation, sound ranging equipment, and increasingly sophisticated radar systems. But the escorts typically flew higher and faster than the bombers, making them more difficult to detect consistently and dramatically, reducing the effective warning time between detection and arrival overhead. By late 1944, American fighter tactics had evolved to maximize this temporal compression. Fighter groups would climb to 25,000 feet or higher during the Channel crossing, reaching this altitude before entering German airspace. As bomber formations approached their targets, escorts would position themselves in loose formations well above and ahead of the bomber stream, maintaining high speed and excellent visibility in all directions. German ground observers or radar operators detecting these high, fast-moving formations might identify them as bombers due to the altitude and the formation characteristics visible on radar scopes. But the actual composition was often pure fighter sweeps specifically designed to engage German interceptors before bombers even arrived. The result was tactical surprise, combined with overwhelming speed advantage. When German fighters scrambled from forward airfields around Berlin or other major targets, they climbed from ground level toward 20,000 feet or higher, a climb that required 8 to 12 minutes depending on aircraft type, pilot technique, and engine condition. During that same period, American Mustangs operating at 25,000 feet could cover 80 to 100 miles, while descending to interception altitude and building tremendous kinetic energy in the process. The mathematics created situations where German pilots received warning of approaching formations, but could not physically reach interception positions before American fighters arrived overhead, traveling at speeds that gave them complete tactical initiative. The 90-second window represented an ASP-80, optimistic scenario that assumed perfect conditions, immediate response, and no complications during scramble or climb out. Reality was consistently worse. Fighter groups based at forward airfields like Rechlin, Tempelhof, or Brandenburg faced continuous harassment from Allied aircraft throughout daylight hours. Ground crews worked frantically to keep fighters operational despite chronic fuel shortages, spare parts shortages, and persistent mechanical problems that resulted from extended service life on airframes and engines that had long exceeded normal operational parameters. Pilots waiting at readiness on cold winter mornings in early 1945 sat in cockpits or near their aircraft, engines pre-warmed to reduce start-up time, parachutes already fastened. But even under these optimal alert conditions, the time from alarm signal to wheels off the ground typically required 2 to 3 minutes minimum. Add 8 to 10 minutes of climb time to reach 20,000 feet, and the total elapsed time from warning to combat-ready status approached 12 minutes. American Mustangs traveling at 350 miles per hour covered approximately 70 miles during that 12-minute interval. Mustangs diving from altitude at 400 miles per hour covered 80 miles in 12 minutes. If German ground controllers detected incoming formations at 80 miles distance, approximately the maximum effective radar range for high-altitude targets under good conditions, and immediately ordered an alert scramble, German fighters would theoretically reach combat altitude just as American fighters arrived overhead. But this best-case scenario ignored multiple complications that plagued German operations throughout 1945. Radar coverage was inconsistent due to equipment failures, power shortages, and systematic destruction of radar stations by Allied attacks. Ground observers often could not distinguish fighter formations from bomber formations until they were considerably closer. Communication systems experienced frequent failures that delayed or garbled warning messages. Pilots sometimes could not start engines immediately due to cold weather, battery problems, or fuel system issues. Aircraft sometimes aborted takeoffs or experienced mechanical failures during climb-out, reducing the number of fighters actually reaching interception altitude. Even when everything worked perfectly, the time compression remained brutal. The specific case of Berlin defense operations illustrated these problems with particular clarity. Berlin sat approximately 110 miles from the western German frontier, the point where American formations typically became clearly identifiable to German observers as they crossed from occupied Netherlands or Belgium into Reich territory. From frontier to Berlin center represented roughly 20 to 25 minutes of flight time for bomber formations flying at 220 miles per hour. For fighter escorts flying at 300 miles per hour at altitude, the same distance could be covered in approximately 22 minutes. For diving fighters traveling at 400 miles per hour, the distance could be covered in less than 17 minutes. German fighters scrambling from Berlin area airfields needed to climb to combat altitude, somewhere between the frontier and the city, to have any chance of engaging escorts before the escorts engaged them. If German fighters took off immediately upon receiving warning of formations crossing the frontier, and if they climbed at maximum rate toward interception positions, they might reach 20,000 feet in approximately 11 to 12 minutes, at which point American escorts could already be overhead or diving to attack from superior positions. The tactical reality forced German pilots into a perpetual disadvantage, where they were climbing through vulnerable altitudes while American fighters descended from above with crushing energy advantage. Mölders understood these mathematics from brutal experience. He had survived more than 300 combat missions, witnessed the systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe through late 1944, and lost dozens of friends and squadron mates to the overwhelming material and tactical advantages Allied forces brought to bear. By March 1945, experienced Luftwaffe pilots like Mölders represented increasingly rare survivors of sustained combat against opponents who possessed better aircraft, better fuel, or more thorough training, and crushing numerical superiority. The degradation of German pilot quality through the final year of war reflected the impossible combat environment created by Allied advantages. New pilots arriving at operational units in 1945 typically had less than half the flight training time that pilots received in 1943. They flew obsolescent aircraft that were often poorly maintained due to parts shortages. They operated under constant fuel restrictions that limited training opportunities and combat flexibility. They faced veteran Allied pilots flying superior aircraft with unlimited fuel, comprehensive training, and overwhelming support infrastructure. The result was a predictable slaughter. German pilot losses through late 1944 and early 1945 reached levels that could not be replaced, even if training facilities had continued operating at full capacity, which they did not due to fuel shortages, instructor shortages, and the systematic destruction of training infrastructure by Allied bombing. Experienced pilots like Mölders, who survived into 1945, did so through a combination of skill, luck, and increasing reluctance to engage in combat, where the odds of survival decreased with each mission. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical evolution of American fighter operations through 1944 demonstrated how completely escort fighters had seized control of the airspace over Germany. Fighter groups no longer simply protected bombers by flying close escort immediately above or beside the bomber formations. Instead, they established roving patrols at high altitude, well ahead of bomber streams, actively seeking out German fighters attempting to organize attacks. This aggressive tactic, often called fighter sweep or freelance hunting, turned the tactical situation completely around from earlier in the war. German fighters that had once attacked bomber formations with relative freedom now found themselves hunted by packs of Mustangs that held every advantage. American pilots could choose when and where to engage based on their superior speed and altitude. They could attack isolated German fighters attempting to climb to combat altitude, break up German formations before they organized for bomber attacks, or simply chase individual German aircraft across the sky until the German pilots ran out of fuel and had to break off combat. The psychological impact on German pilots was devastating. Combat reports from late 1944 and early 1945 frequently mention the stress and fear German pilots experienced, knowing they were operating at fundamental disadvantage against opponents who could dictate the terms of every engagement. Some German pilots became increasingly cautious, breaking off attacks or refusing combat when they assessed the tactical situation as hopeless. Others adopted desperately aggressive tactics, accepting high risk in exchange for any chance of damaging bombers before American fighters destroyed them. Neither approach significantly improved German success rates or reduced Allied bombing effectiveness. The systematic destruction of German aviation fuel production and distribution infrastructure through targeted Allied bombing made the tactical situation even worse. By early 1945, Luftwaffe units operated under severe fuel rationing that limited training flights, restricted combat operations, and forced pilots to conserve fuel even during combat, which reduced their already limited tactical flexibility. American pilots, by contrast, flew with abundant fuel supplies that allowed them to use full power whenever tactically advantageous, maintain extended patrols over German territory, and pursue German fighters aggressively without concern for fuel reserves. This fuel disparity, combined with performance advantages and numerical superiority, created an operational environment where German fighters seldom achieved favorable combat outcomes, even when they managed to engage American formations. The compression of reaction time to approximately 90 seconds between warning and engagement represented the final stage in the Allied achievement of absolute air superiority over Germany. German air defense had evolved from a relatively effective system in 1942 through mid-1943 to a completely overwhelmed system by early 1945. The speed and altitude at which American fighters operated, combined with their numerical superiority and tactical aggressiveness, had made coordinated German air defense functionally impossible. Individual German pilots might still score occasional victories through exceptional skill or fortunate circumstances, but these isolated successes had no impact on strategic outcomes or on the systematic destruction of German industrial capacity, transportation infrastructure, and urban areas by continuous Allied bombing operations. The 90-second warning window was not just a tactical disadvantage. It represented the cumulative effect of Allied advantages in aircraft design, engine performance, fuel quality, pilot training, and operational doctrine that had transformed the air war over Europe from a contested struggle into a one-sided demonstration of overwhelming material and technological superiority. Werner Mölders pushed his throttle forward, feeling his Messerschmitt strain upward through the cold air. His wingmen stayed close, maintaining formation discipline even as they all knew the mathematics were against them. The radio crackled again with updated information from the ground controller, but Mölders barely listened. He had heard it all before. Multiple enemy formations, high altitude, fast-moving, and his small formation of 6 fighters climbing toward 20,000 feet while American Mustangs already waited somewhere above them, traveling at speeds that would bring them overhead in seconds, not minutes. The war had become an exercise in futility, a demonstration of what happened when one side possessed such overwhelming advantages that tactics and courage could no longer compensate for material inferiority. Mölders would fly this mission because that was his duty, but he harbored no illusions about likely outcomes. The Americans would appear overhead, traveling at over 400 miles per hour, diving from altitude with energy that made them nearly impossible to evade. His formation would scatter, each pilot fighting individually for survival rather than attempting coordinated attacks on bombers they would probably never reach. Some of his pilots would not return, their losses would be recorded, their aircraft would not be replaced, and tomorrow or the next day, the same scenario would repeat with different pilots in different fighters facing the same impossible odds against the same overwhelming opponent. This was how air superiority ended, not with dramatic final battles, but with the systematic elimination of an opponent who could no longer compete in the most fundamental categories of aerial warfare: speed, altitude, numbers, and time. The contrails ahead marked where American fighters flew, high and fast, waiting for German fighters to climb into range. Mölders checked his fuel gauge, noted his ammunition count, and calculated in his head how many more minutes he could sustain combat operations before fuel constraints forced him to break off and return to base. 90 seconds had seemed like adequate warning time when the controller first announced incoming formations. But 90 seconds was barely enough time to register the threat, much less to organize an effective response against opponents who traveled at speeds that compressed tactical decisions to split-second reactions. The sky above Berlin belonged to the Americans now, just as the skies above all of Germany belonged to whoever possessed faster aircraft, better fuel, more pilots, and the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. The Luftwaffe had lost the air war, not through any single decisive battle, but through the accumulated weight of countless small disadvantages that combined into overwhelming defeat. The 90-second warning was just one more manifestation of that defeat, one more tactical problem that had no solution within the resources and capabilities available to German forces in March 1945. The technical factors that created the 90-second warning problem had their origins in fundamental design philosophy differences between German and American aircraft development programs. German fighters through 1943 prioritized climb rate, maneuverability, and firepower optimized for bomber interception missions flown from interior positions within occupied Europe. American fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, reflected different design priorities driven by the specific strategic requirements of long-range bomber escort missions, flown from Britain deep into continental Europe. The Packard Merlin V-1650 engine that powered the P-51 incorporated a two-stage, two-speed supercharger system that maintained excellent power output at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where German fighters experienced significant performance degradation. The Daimler-Benz DB605 engine in the Messerschmitt BF-109G and the BMW 801D radial in the Focke-Wulf FW190A both used single-stage superchargers that provided good performance at the lower altitudes, but could not sustain power output as effectively above 20,000 feet. This altitude performance differential translated directly into tactical advantage. At 25,000 feet, a P-51D Mustang could achieve approximately 437 miles per hour in level flight using standard 130 grade fuel. The same aircraft, using 150 grade fuel, which became widely available to American fighter units by late 1944, could exceed 448 miles per hour at the same altitude. A Messerschmitt BF-109G6 at 25,000 feet achieved approximately 390 miles per hour maximum speed. The Focke-Wulf FW190A8 managed roughly 400 miles per hour at that altitude under optimal conditions. The 40 to 50 mile per hour speed advantage the Mustang possessed at high altitude meant American pilots could control engagement geometry, choosing when to fight and when to disengage based on tactical considerations rather than performance limitations. German pilots attempting to break off combat found themselves pursued by fighters that were simply faster, and attempts to dive away from American fighters resulted in even greater speed disadvantages, because the P-51's clean aerodynamic design generated less drag during high-speed dives than the stubbier German fighters. The laminar flow wing design, developed by North American aviation engineers specifically for the P-51, reduced drag throughout the aircraft's flight envelope, contributing to both high maximum speed and exceptional range characteristics. German aerodynamicists understood laminar flow principles, but German fighter designs prioritized other characteristics like high roll rate and tight turning radius that required different wing geometries. The resulting aircraft performed excellently at lower altitudes and slower speeds, but could not match the Mustang's performance where American bomber operations actually occurred, at altitudes between 20,000 and 28,000 feet. Range represented another critical advantage that directly affected the warning time problem. A P-51D carrying two external drop tanks of 108 gallons each, plus internal fuel of 269 gallons, possessed total fuel capacity of 485 gallons. At normal cruise power settings, this fuel load provided range exceeding 1,600 miles, sufficient for missions from England to Berlin and back, with reserves for extended combat over the target area. German fighters operated from bases much closer to their interception zones, but carried considerably less fuel. A BF-109G6 carried approximately 88 gallons of internal fuel, providing combat radius of approximately 300 miles. This limited range forced German pilots to carefully manage fuel consumption during every mission, climbing directly to interception altitude and avoiding unnecessary maneuvering that consumed fuel without tactical benefit. American pilots flying with abundant fuel reserves could afford to climb to maximum altitude during channel crossing, cruise at high speed throughout the mission, engage in extended combat, and still return safely with adequate reserves. This fuel disparity became more pronounced through late 1944 and into 1945 as Allied bombing systematically destroyed German fuel production and distribution infrastructure. The synthetic fuel plants that produced most of Germany's aviation gasoline became priority targets for American heavy bombers after May 1944. Raids on facilities at Leuna, Politz, Berlin, and other locations destroyed refining capacity faster than it could be rebuilt or repaired. By January 1945, German aviation fuel production had fallen to less than 20% of peak capacity achieved in early 1944. The operational impact was immediate and devastating. Luftwaffe units received fuel allocations that covered only essential combat operations, with training flights severely restricted or eliminated entirely. Pilots who might have flown multiple training missions per week in 1943 now flew perhaps 1 or 2 familiarization flights before being declared combat ready and assigned to operational units. The resulting pilot quality degradation was severe and cumulative. New pilots arriving at frontline units lacked basic combat skills, situational awareness, and the instinctive reactions that came only from extensive flight experience. These inexperienced pilots faced American opponents who had received thorough training in the United States, additional combat training in England, and who flew aircraft that were easier to operate than their German equivalents. The P-51 possessed lighter control forces than the BF-109, better visibility from the cockpit, and more forgiving stall characteristics. It was, in the assessment of pilots who flew both types, simply easier to fly well, which meant that pilots with moderate skill levels could employ the aircraft effectively, while less skilled pilots could survive long enough to gain experience. German fighters required more pilot skill to exploit their performance characteristics effectively. The BF-109 had narrow landing gear that made ground handling difficult and caused numerous landing accidents among inexperienced pilots. The aircraft's light controls became very heavy at high speeds, requiring significant physical strength to maneuver aggressively. The cockpit visibility was notably poor, with substantial blind spots behind and below the pilot that made spotting attacking aircraft difficult. These characteristics meant that only highly skilled, experienced pilots could fully exploit the aircraft's capabilities, and by 1945, such pilots represented an increasingly small fraction of available Luftwaffe personnel. The combination of inferior aircraft performance, inadequate fuel supplies, poor pilot training, and overwhelming American numerical superiority created tactical situations where German fighters could rarely engage on favorable terms, regardless of how quickly they responded to warnings of incoming raids. The 90-second warning time represented just one element in a comprehensive system of disadvantages that made effective air defense impossible. Even when German fighters received earlier warning and managed to climb to interception altitude before American escorts arrived, they typically found themselves outnumbered by ratios of 3-to-1 or worse. American fighter groups by early 1945 routinely dispatched formations of 48 or more aircraft on single missions. Multiple fighter groups operated simultaneously, providing overlapping coverage throughout the bomber stream and creating situations where German fighters attempting to attack bombers from one direction found themselves bounced by American fighters attacking from another direction. The Americans practiced tactical coordination that German units could no longer match due to communication difficulties, fuel restrictions, and the general collapse of organized air defense coordination. Specific combat examples from early 1945 illustrated how completely the tactical situation had turned against German pilots. On February 3, 1945, the 8th Air Force dispatched over 1,400 heavy bombers, escorted by approximately 900 fighters, to attack transportation targets across central Germany, including major raids on Berlin. German controllers detected the incoming formations early and ordered maximum effort interceptions. Approximately 350 Luftwaffe fighters scrambled from bases across northern and central Germany. The resulting combats occurred under conditions that demonstrated every disadvantage German pilots faced. American fighters positioned themselves between the climbing German formations and the approaching bomber stream. The escorts engaged German fighters while they were still climbing through 15,000 to 20,000 feet, forcing combat at altitudes where German aircraft had not yet reached optimal performance and where pilots had limited energy for defensive maneuvering. The Americans attacked in multiple waves, with some fighters engaging while others maintained altitude advantage for subsequent attacks on German fighters that survived the initial encounters. German pilots who attempted to disengage found themselves pursued by faster aircraft. Those who continued climbing toward bombers ran into additional fighter formations, positioned specifically to intercept fighters that penetrated the initial escort screen. The few German fighters that reached bombing altitude and attempted attacks on bomber formations encountered massed defensive fire from tightly coordinated bomber boxes, plus immediate response from escort fighters that had been maintaining close support positions specifically to counter such attacks. The combat lasted approximately 35 minutes from initial contact to the final German fighters breaking off and fleeing toward their bases. American forces claimed 63 German aircraft destroyed with an additional 19 probables and 37 damaged. Actual German losses were recorded as 41 fighters destroyed with 38 pilots killed or missing and 3 wounded. American losses were 4 fighters destroyed and 2 damaged, with 3 pilots killed and 1 wounded. The loss ratio of better than 10-1 reflected not individual pilot skill, but rather the systematic advantages American forces possessed in every dimension of aerial combat. These tactical realities forced German commanders to reconsider fundamental air defense doctrine through the final months of the war. Traditional interception tactics that relied on climbing to altitude, organizing coordinated attacks, and engaging bomber formations with sufficient numbers to overwhelm defensive fire no longer worked against opponents who possessed escort fighters in overwhelming numbers, operating at superior altitudes with superior speed. Some German commanders advocated concentrating remaining fighters for massive attacks on single bomber formations, accepting heavy losses in exchange for inflicting significant damage on at least some attacking forces. This approach, called Großschlag or Great Blow, required gathering large fighter formations of 200 or more aircraft, climbing to altitude outside the range of American escorts, then diving in mass on a single bomber formation in hopes that concentrated attacks would overwhelm escorts and defensive fire. The concept was theoretically sound but practically impossible to execute given fuel shortages, communication difficulties, and the challenge of assembling large formations without being detected and intercepted by American fighters that were specifically hunting for such concentrations. One attempted execution of this concept occurred on January 1, 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte, a large-scale German attack on Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands. The operation involved approximately 850 Luftwaffe fighters, launched in a coordinated surprise attack on multiple Allied airfields at dawn. The goal was to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground and disrupt air operations supporting the German offensive in the Ardennes. The operation achieved tactical surprise and inflicted significant damage, destroying or damaging approximately 465 Allied aircraft, mostly on the ground. However, German losses were catastrophic. Approximately 277 German aircraft were destroyed, with 214 pilots killed, missing, or captured, and 18 wounded. Many losses resulted from German fighters being shot down by their own anti-aircraft defenses during the return flight, a consequence of poor coordination and communication failures, but substantial losses also occurred from combat with Allied fighters that scrambled during the attacks and from ground fire at the targeted airfields. The operation demonstrated that even when German fighters achieved surprise and committed overwhelming numbers to specific targets, the loss ratios remained unsustainable, and the strategic impact minimal, because Allied aircraft production could replace losses within days, while German losses could not be replaced at all. By March 1945, when Werner Mölders flew his interception mission over Berlin, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased functioning as a coordinated air defense force. Individual units still flew missions when fuel was available, but systematic air defense of German territory had become impossible. American bombers ranged across Germany virtually unopposed, attacking transportation networks, oil facilities, factories, and urban areas with increasing frequency and devastating effect. Fighter escorts accompanied every mission, but increasingly they encountered no opposition. On missions where German fighters did appear, the combats were brief and one-sided. American fighter pilots in March and April 1945 frequently reported entire missions without encountering any German aircraft. When they did find opponents, the Germans were usually inexperienced pilots, flying alone or in pairs, easily shot down by coordinated American formations that held every tactical advantage. The veteran German pilots who survived to this point flew rarely, conserving their skills for a final battle that never came because there was no fuel to support sustained operations, and no strategic purpose that such operations could achieve. The psychological impact on German pilots during this final phase was profound. Combat reports and post-war interviews reveal that many pilots understood the war was lost but continued flying from a sense of duty, loyalty to comrades, or simply because they had no other role in a collapsing society. Some pilots deliberately avoided combat when possible, going through the motions of interception attempts but breaking off before decisive engagement. Others flew with fatalistic acceptance, expecting each mission to be their last and feeling surprised when they survived another day. The contrast with American pilot experiences was stark. American pilots flew with confidence born from consistent success, superior equipment, excellent training, and absolute air superiority. Combat reports from American fighter pilots in early 1945 often read like hunting narratives rather than accounts of contested air battles. Pilots described spotting lone German fighters, diving to attack from superior position, engaging briefly, and claiming victories against opponents who could rarely maneuver effectively or escape. The Americans understood they held overwhelming advantages and exploited those advantages methodically. The technical evolution of American fighter tactics through the final year of war demonstrated how completely escort fighters had shifted from defensive to offensive roles. Early escort doctrine in 1943 emphasized staying close to bomber formations, positioning fighters immediately above and beside the bombers to intercept attacking German fighters before they reached attack positions. This defensive approach worked but limited the fighters' effectiveness because it surrendered initiative to the attackers and forced escorts to react to German tactical choices. By mid-1944, American commanders had developed more aggressive tactics that positioned fighters well ahead of bomber streams in loose formations at maximum altitude. These advanced fighters actively sought out German fighters attempting to organize attacks, engaging them before they could reach bombers, and forcing German pilots into defensive combat far from the bomber formations they were supposed to attack. This freelance hunting approach exploited the Mustang's speed and range characteristics, allowing fighters to roam over German territory hunting for opponents rather than waiting for attacks to develop. The evolution continued through late 1944, with the development of fighter sweeps conducted independently of bomber operations. Fighter groups would fly missions specifically to hunt German fighters, attacking airfields, strafing aircraft on the ground, and engaging any German fighters that attempted to intercept them. These operations served multiple purposes, including destroying German aircraft, killing experienced German pilots, forcing the Luftwaffe to commit remaining fighters to defensive operations, and demonstrating to German military and civilian population that the Allies controlled German airspace completely. The psychological impact of these fighter sweeps extended beyond their direct combat results. German civilians watching American fighters circle overhead at low altitude, machine gunning trains, trucks, and airfields without encountering any opposition, understood viscerally that Germany had lost the air war. German pilots watching from the ground as American fighters destroyed their aircraft on parking aprons, unable to take off due to fuel shortages or mechanical problems, experienced the humiliation of impotent defeat. The systematic demonstration of overwhelming superiority demoralized German forces more effectively than propaganda could ever achieve. The final accounting of the air war over Germany reflected these cumulative advantages. The 8th Air Force, operating primarily from England against targets in Germany and occupied Europe, flew approximately 435,000 sorties between August 1942 and May 1945. These operations dropped approximately 740,000 tons of bombs on German targets. The 8th Air Force lost approximately 5,400 aircraft to all causes, with roughly half those losses attributable to enemy fighters and half to anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, and accidents. German fighter forces opposing these operations suffered vastly greater losses. Exact figures are difficult to establish due to incomplete German records and the chaos of the war's final months, but estimates suggest the Luftwaffe lost between 45,000 and 50,000 aircraft to all causes on all fronts between 1943 and 1945, with at least half those losses occurring in operations against American and British forces in the West. Personnel losses were even more catastrophic. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 90,000 aircrew killed or missing through the entire war, with the majority of these losses occurring in 1944 and 1945, when pilot training had degraded severely and loss rates had accelerated dramatically. These statistics reflected not just tactical defeats but strategic collapse. Germany's aircraft production actually increased through 1944 despite Allied bombing, with factories producing approximately 39,000 aircraft in 1944 compared to 25,000 in 1943. But these aircraft could not be flown effectively due to fuel shortages, pilot shortages, and the overwhelming Allied numerical and tactical superiority. Aircraft sat on factory airfields, awaiting delivery to operational units that had no fuel to fly them or no pilots qualified to fly them. The synthetic fuel crisis that developed after May 1944, when Allied bombers began systematically targeting oil production facilities, created cascading failures throughout the German war effort. Without adequate fuel, the Luftwaffe could not train replacement pilots. Without trained pilots, new aircraft sat unused. Without effective air defense, Allied bombers attacked with impunity. Without industrial production and transportation networks that bombers systematically destroyed, Germany could not rebuild damaged facilities or replace lost equipment. The cycle was self-reinforcing and ultimately irreversible. Werner Mölders survived his March 7th interception attempt, though his formation scattered before making contact with American bombers and one of his wingmen was shot down by diving Mustangs that appeared overhead exactly as the ground controller had warned, 90 seconds after the initial alert, but with such speed and altitude advantage that defensive maneuvering proved futile. Mölders continued flying missions through March and into early April as fuel supplies permitted, which was increasingly rare as distribution networks collapsed under Allied bombing and advancing ground forces. His final combat mission occurred on April 16, 1945, when he led a formation of 4 BF-109 seconds against a bomber formation attacking oil facilities near Leipzig. American escorts engaged his formation before they reached the bombers. Mölders damaged one P-51, but his aircraft suffered hits that damaged his cooling system. He crash-landed near Brandenburg, surviving with minor injuries. He never flew again. The airfield was captured by Soviet forces 3 days later. Mölders spent the next 4 years in Soviet captivity before repatriation to Germany in 1949. His experience was typical of thousands of German pilots who survived the war's final months through some combination of skill, luck, and circumstances beyond their control. Those who survived carried memories of overwhelming defeat, of flying obsolescent aircraft against superior opponents who possessed every advantage, of watching friends die in unequal combat, of understanding intellectually that the war was lost, but continuing to fly from duty or habit or simple inability to imagine alternative action. The 90-second warning that Werner Mölders received on that March morning represented more than just a tactical limitation. It symbolized the comprehensive failure of German air power in the face of Allied advantages in industrial capacity, technological development, fuel production, pilot training, and operational coordination. The warning time had shrunk from the hours German pilots enjoyed in 1942 to minutes in 1943 to seconds in 1945, as American fighters became faster, more numerous, and more aggressively employed in roles that transformed them from defensive escorts to offensive hunters dominating the skies over Germany. The psychological shift this temporal compression created was profound. German pilots in 1942 flew with confidence based on superior training, excellent equipment, and tactical success. Pilots in 1943 flew with growing concern, but still believed they could inflict significant losses on Allied formations. Pilots in 1944 flew with the understanding that they were unlikely to survive many missions, but hoped to inflict some damage before being killed or captured. Pilots in 1945 flew with fatalistic acceptance that they were participating in a lost cause, flying obsolescent aircraft against superior opponents for purposes that no longer had strategic meaning. The collapse was not sudden, but rather accumulated through countless small defeats, each one reducing German capabilities while Allied capabilities increased. The 90-second warning time was simultaneously cause and effect of this collapse. It resulted from American fighters being faster and operating at higher altitudes, where they could cover distances more quickly. It contributed to German defeat by making organized interception impossible and forcing German pilots into reactive defensive combat, where all advantages belonged to the Americans. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.